I've gotten so many text messages from Liz Cheney, and I'm like, Liz, I love you.
Liz, girl, stop.
Yeah, love your work on the January 6th committee, but I'm going to need you to stop. I'm already not voting for anyone who even like has a whiff of Trumpism attached to them.
Welcome to Millennial, the home of pretend adulting and real talk. I'm Andrew.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Pamela.
And I'm also sporting my Childless Dog Ladies for Kamala t-shirt. It finally came in the mail.
That came fast after you got the alert.
I'm so
saying
happy
it
for you.
I know. Yeah. It's got a cute puppy on it. I walked with it outside earlier today while walking Brooklyn. I was making sure nobody looked at me because I didn't want them to come for me or anything like that. But yes, it's here, and it's a pretty nice shirt. It even says Union Made at the bottom of it, just like the hat does.
I feel like that's one of those designs that it's if you know, you know. Yeah. I don't think most people,
it's subtle.
It is subtle. Apologize. It's very cute.
Yeah, because the text is kind of small. Like, unless you're really staring at it, you're not going to notice. That's why we put a lot of obscene phrases on our Millennial Word Cloud tee really small, because nobody will notice, but you will. They're not obscene words. Maybe that's
They're
a bit
for
extreme,
you,
but
not for the general public.
Exactly. So I'm all set now. I got my camo hat, and I got my Childless Dog Lady tee. And what cracks me up about this Dog Lady tee is it kind of has renewed interest after the debate talking about the dogs being eaten in Springfield, Ohio. Like, Trump and Vance can't stop talking about animals.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Still as relevant as ever.
So embarrassing. Well, I also got something in the mail, but admittedly, it was not as exciting as your Childless Dog Ladies shirt. I got my voter election guide, and I was actually surprised that. Yeah, well, I was surprised that it showed up because last year they sent a letter asking if I wanted to go electronic for that to just like save paper. And I was like, sure, that's fine. Like, I could definitely look that up. I don't need the physical guide, but they sent it to me anyway. So I was like, oh, nice surprise. But that to me is my signifier that like the ballot is coming and that, the election is very close. So
the ballot is coming.
Yeah, I'm excited to leaf through that because, it's not just the big elections that matter. It's also the small elections. And that's going to have all the info for all the propositions and the bills. And
also, Pam, you just reminded me of this. I'm so glad we're talking about this. Georgia voters, something that I noticed when I requested my absentee ballot, my settings to receive confirmation of my ballot being received had been turned off, which I always have on and have had on in years past. So when you're requesting your absentee ballot, if you're in Georgia, there's like a couple of little radio buttons underneath the section where you like click for your settings and where you click to request your ballot. Be sure that those notifications are turned on so that you get a text message and or email when your ballot has been received and processed. I was very dismayed to see that it had been turned off. I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
I'm sure people in other states should be taking a look at that too, because I imagine other states have that type of option. Well, speaking of merchandise purchases, I also wanted to call out so my mom is very excited that Kamala is running, and she bought the Chuck Taylors that Kamala is always walking around in.
The platform ones?
Yeah, and she's so proud of herself.
I have those, and they're very comfortable, and your mom probably looks super fashionable, so...
yeah, she does. She does. And my brother, he lives in an apartment complex in Florida now, and the downstairs neighbors put out a Trump flag on like their balcony, their apartment balcony. But so last week, my brother bought a Kamala flag and he put it on his balcony. So now they're waging a war.
I told you before the show, I'm thinking about doing the same thing because we have two neighbors around the corner that are also waving their Trump flags. And then one of them has like this big, like terrifyingly large Trump banner on one side of his garage. And it's like Trump riding a tank. Yeah.
Yikes. That's disgusting.
As if he could or would. That's all I'll say.
The draft dodger
Jesus.
leading the charge.
Yeah, please.
He's masculine. Don't you know that? Couple of political updates I wanted to touch on. Kamala has accepted an October 23rd debate on CNN. Trump has yet to accept, and I think right now it's probably safe to say he won't accept. He is also saying now it's too late to debate because people will have already started voting, which, I mean, yeah, but that isn't an excuse to not debate.
But hey, we have another debate coming up next week that we're all excited about, right?
The VP
Tim Walz,
debate.
JD Vance, man.
October 1st, the debate begins at 9 p.m. Eastern. And just like we did for the Kamala versus Donald debate, we will be live streaming on Patreon immediately after the debate. So expect us to start live streaming around 10:30 p.m. Eastern. So please join in. And if you aren't a patron, hit up patreon.com/millennial and you can participate in our review and reaction to the debate that night. And we will have the episode out the following day. Also wanted to mention, Trump is now claiming that he won't run again in 2028. Do we believe that?
I mean,
unless he's in prison.
The passage of time, I think, is a relevant factor here, considering that he is 78 years old. Mm-hmm. So there's a possibility that time may make that impossible. But I don't believe it. I think if he had a chance to run to try and benefit himself, I think he'd still do it.
Yeah, exactly. But I do believe him because running for president must be exhausting, constantly traveling, having to deal with the media and all this stuff. Like, for anybody, it would be extremely exhausting. He's done it 3 times now. So to do it a 4th time at 82 years old, dude, hit the golf course, let it go already. And plus, there's that chance he'll be in prison, so he won't be able to anyway.
Right. Do you think that's his implication? I feel like he kind of did this in 2020, didn't he? Where he was like, if I don't win, you'll never see me again. And we were all like, yeah, because you'll be in prison, bitch. And it's like, never mind on that front. Can't fucking get rid of the guy.
Somebody did tell me that he did say this around 2020, and yet we are still dealing with him. So I guess we just have to not believe him, as much as I want to believe it's true this time.
So something else we want to do, because we know the next few weeks, at the very least, are going to be really politics heavy, with a really big focus on the Harris-Trump race for the presidency. We did want to take some time at the top of each show to feature one down ballot race that maybe you haven't heard very much about. And I picked this week's. Certainly welcome all of y'all's feedback about other races we should be featuring. But this week, I want to feature Sally Duvall, who is running for the Texas State House in the 73rd District. And her platform is basically like a lefty wet dream. I'm not going to lie. Like, I don't think Texas is ready for this yet, but it makes me really happy to see candidates throwing their hat in the ring who are like unapologetically progressive. So first and foremost, her platform is pro marijuana legalization. So if you watch her campaign ad, she's literally smoking a fat blunt throughout the entire thing. But she has a really common sense argument about the status of like the legal or illegal status of marijuana, where she was like, it's illegal in Texas, and yet people can legally go to smoke shops that are basically on every corner and buy Delta 8, Delta 9 products. And we should just be legalizing marijuana so that we can regulate it to make sure it's safe, and also so that we can make money off of it by taxing it. And she sort of left off towards the end by saying, like, it shouldn't be up to the government to tell Texans what they can put in their bodies. And I was like, fuck yeah, because that is the argument that you hear a lot of the time from like opponents of government regulation, that the government shouldn't be able to tell you what you can or can't do in your free time or on your private property. So she definitely has that energy. But I will say that's not the only part of her platform that really appeals to me. She's very pro education, pro common gun sense laws, pro climate change legislation. She specifically called out water conservation, which made me think of you, Andrew, because that's also a big issue in Texas right now. So I'm just really thrilled to see like an extremely progressive candidate throwing her hat in the ring. I don't know how it's going to go this time around, but I think the more time that passes and the more progressive voices who do stand up, I think we can move the needle. So I was just really excited. Sally Duvall, y'all, you should check out her campaign ad. It's really good.
Sally Duvall, y'all. That's got a good ring to it.
Right?
That should be the campaign slogan. Well, speaking of Texas, Laura, I just saw this today. I didn't realize this. Ted Cruz is in a tight race for Senate this November. Remember, Beto really gave him a run for his money a few years ago, and now he's in a tight race again. This time it's against Colin Allred. So we'll see how that plays out.
They're neck and neck. And yo, you know what the funniest thing is? Liz Cheney is campaigning for Colin Allred.
That's great. I mean, she's
incredible.
I don't know if she's campaigning for Kamala, but she's certainly endorsed him already.
Yeah. I mean, I'm getting text. I'm in Georgia. So being in a swing state as I am, RIP my inbox and my text messages because it never fucking ends. I've gotten so many text messages from Liz Cheney and I'm like, Liz, I love
Liz,
you.
Girl, stop.
Yeah, love your work on the January 6th committee, but I'm going to need you to stop. I'm already not voting for anyone who even like has a whiff of Trumpism attached to them. So you're good.
Why don't you text me outside of the election cycle? Why only when you need me?
Why don't you just don't care about me unless you need my vote.
Laura, I'm also in a swing state, also getting texts from every politician and celebrity. Robert De Niro has texted me multiple times. Michelle has texted me, Barack. And I guess, do you get the same thing where the text starts with a photo of them to like convince us they are texting us? Like, what the hell? What am I supposed to take from that?
Oh, I've started getting ones where they're trying to they've tried to start leading them off with hooks. Like, do you remember me? Hey, Laura, it's Michelle. Like, all this kind of shit. Are you going
to the barbecue Saturday?
What? Yeah, to like try and trick me into opening it. And I'm like, I'm going to open it anyway because it annoys me to see the blue dot, even though I'm going to delete it. But I don't know. Like, I'm not going to read it, girl.
No,
You already got my vote.
I've been replying stop to all these. I can't take it.
Same. Yeah. I report everything to junk. I tell them to stop, and it doesn't stop. It's an onslaught. It's literally going to, because we're going to have a runoff here in Georgia as well in December. We already know. It's going to be a fucking onslaught through the inauguration.
That's what's going on with the election. We'll continue to talk about it in the weeks ahead. Again, join us next Tuesday night for the VP debate. We'll be reacting to it afterwards. We are going to get into some other topics today, but first we're going to take a quick break and we will be right back.
So I wanted to talk with you all about trigger warnings this week. And to kick things off, I wanted to know specifically if you've noticed seeing trigger warnings more and more prefacing whatever television content you've been consuming, because I know I definitely have.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems like it.
Yeah, this has been actually happening for a while, but I guess the general public is kind of now starting to take offense, at least according to this piece that Variety put out a few months ago. Specifically, they were talking in this article about how trigger warnings are great for people that need them, but they're also riddled with spoilers. And that's why TV fans are now getting upset about seeing these more and more. Sometimes they also like will allude to like deaths that have maybe felt like they were coming up in television shows. So if they see that trigger warning right at the beginning, they're like, oh, well, that character is done for. Great. Thanks so much. Netflix, for example, for letting me know in advance. So there's kind of like this weird beef that people are having now with trigger warnings. The article also laid out some examples. And I guess like if you're sensitive to spoilers, maybe skip ahead a few seconds while I read through some of these. Baby Reindeer, which won big at the Emmys this year, was one of the shows that people took offense with. They actually put a trigger warning right before this shocking assault scene. And I guess it was a big moment on the show. I haven't seen it, but the trigger warning read that the following episode contains depictions of sexual violence, which some viewers may find troubling. So that kind of like gave away some big moment the show had been building up to, and people were upset about that. Apple TV Plus has also done this with Severance. They tipped off quite a few viewers to the fact that an episode cliffhanger would include depictions of self-harm. So people were very quickly able to figure out which character that was going to affect based on, context clues that had been building up to that episode. I know that, Andrew, you're a fan of Better Call Saul. They've also been brought up in terms of this controversy with TV viewers. So this actually happened internationally. And I guess the trigger warning over there foreshadowed a major character death with a suicide hotline number. Usually suicide hotline numbers actually are posted after the episode ends. It's like the PSA. But in this particular case, the streamer that has the rights put it before the episode started. So people got spoiled on that.
In the case of the Better Call Saul spoiler, without them even saying what character they're talking about in this article, I know what scene that was across the 5 seasons. And in that case, what they were spoiling is something that had been building for several episodes. This character in the series is very troubled, and you could imagine him going this way. So if I read that in advance of seeing the episode for my first time, I could easily make an educated guess on what character it's going to be. And then a very pivotal moment in the show that affects the entire rest of the series is spoiled for me. So I would have been very annoyed if I saw that at the beginning. And Pam, you had mentioned normally the suicide hotline numbers appear at the end, which is great. No problem with that. But when you warn of something like that earlier on, especially when viewers can probably guess who it's going to be, that's a problem.
Yeah, it seems like it's the specificity that is actually starting to bother people, because obviously we've always seen warnings for ratings, and the article goes into that too. But usually the warnings for why something is rated, say like MA, is just like sexual content, nudity, violence. It's not like so specific that you have to worry about the reason for the rating being the reason why you get spoiled on maybe a major plot point. So with that in mind, I wanted to know, like, do you all like pay attention when these trigger warnings pop up on the screen? Because I will, just out of curiosity, because the warning makes you feel like you should pay attention, right? If something's prefaced with a warning, you think like, oh, this is serious. But I don't think that I really like pay enough attention to like have this like affect my viewing. I don't know. What about you two?
Yeah, I feel similar. The only example of one of these that I can remember that I actually made a connection between the trigger warning and what was probably going to come up in the episode was in the most recent season of The Boys. And I don't want to spoil anyone who hasn't seen any of it yet, but the spoiler warning in that episode directly referenced something that happened in the episode, but it wasn't surprising to me given the setting of the show. I kind of figured that was where it was going to go anyway. So when I saw that spoiler warning, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it didn't spoil like any character deaths. So I guess they managed to like thread the needle really well with that particular one, because I didn't go into the episode being like, oh fuck, now I know what happens. you
Mhm.
know? But I can totally see how if they had been more specific about some of the violence, I might have been tipped off and I would have been pretty pissed.
It's interesting you mentioned The Boys too, Laura, because we asked patrons for some feedback on trigger warnings, and several actually did mention The Boys. That one does seem to issue quite a few trigger warnings, or
Yeah.
uh, steps into some very controversial material. I mean, we've all seen it here. We know that for sure. I am coming at this from a place where I have been fortunate to not have experienced many traumatic events that would stop me from watching an episode of TV, film, or reading a book. If I was given that warning in advance. But I also feel like down the road, at some point, I'm going to have, unfortunately, some really bad or traumatic experiences that might cause me to start avoiding certain things if I see the trigger warnings. So I certainly understand why these warnings are there. But to a point that's actually being brought up in the Discord, Ariel is pointing out that the trigger warnings can be inconsistent because the people at these studios are having to draw a line somewhere too. So you also just can't please everybody. Or maybe you're being a little too cautious by throwing out the trigger warning. You're being a little too detailed. It's just a very messy situation between
It kind of
spoilers and
seems
lines.
it kind of seems like streamers should have some kind of consistent requirement for the shows that they feature.
Mm-hmm.
Like rather than leaving it up to the studios to dictate what the trigger warnings should be, maybe it should be up to the streamers so that you're getting a consistent treatment across everything.
Yeah.
Um, Actually, something that Michelle brought up in our Discord, um, she was saying, I'd rather be spoiled if it means keeping someone safe. Totally understand that. But she also added, I reckon streaming services should have an option to turn trigger warnings on or off, though. I totally agree with that, especially if you're
That would be
someone
cool.
who doesn't, maybe you don't feel like you need the trigger warnings, but you don't want to run the risk of being spoiled. I think that's a great
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, I think that I think you're onto something there, Laura, because none of these streamers have a very sophisticated way to filter through content. But I'm just thinking about like the way Archive of Our Own works, for example, which is a great example of how you can curate your own content. It's a fan fiction site for anyone that doesn't know. But you can literally sit there and be like, I don't want to see this. I don't want to see this. I don't want to see this. And as soon as you click all those boxes, you can even type in your own tag. Then it'll just completely like get rid of those search results for you. And I think that if something like that existed on some of these streamers, which obviously they have enough money to like redo or update their interfaces and their search optimization, then it might make it easier for people to like know which shows to avoid without actually having to sit through like trigger warnings. Cause I imagine that must be frustrating too when you get to something that could potentially be triggering for you. And then you say, oh, well, now I can't enjoy this one episode.
And we're also talking about streaming platforms that already offer you the ability to skip recaps, skip intros, skip credits.
Yeah.
Surely there could be another setting that lets you skip the trigger warning too, or just disable them entirely.
Or skip that scene. That would be cool.
Or skip.
Yeah.
I was also thinking, and honestly, I feel like we're on a better track here thinking about like how the streamers could better optimize this for user experience. But I was also thinking like it'd be really great if there was some sort of online guide, and maybe there is. Please, if there is, and if anyone uses it, I would love to know if something like that exists. But it would be really cool if there was like an independent guide that someone could go look up to see like, is there a trigger warning attached to this? And what is the subject matter so that I can know whether or not I even want to mess with it to begin with.
Yeah.
There is a guide that, God, what is it called? Let me see if I can find it really quick. But anyway, like it's really more for parents so that they understand why shows are rated what they are. But I do appreciate the way that like reviewers there will like expand on like, say there's a content warning for like nudity, but nudity can mean a lot of things. and the MPA is also like riddled with issues in terms of how ratings work over there. But people that review those shows, which I think they can either be like parents or actual like teens or kids, can say like, oh, this is like the exact nudity. Sometimes it's just like the back of someone's back. And sometimes it's like full frontal, but there's a big difference between like showing somebody's naked back and showing like boobs or penis.
Yeah.
So
I never understand when it's like, it's just a butt. Like, why is this
it's
being,
just a butt.
Yeah, like literally everyone is born with one.
Common Sense Media, Parents Guide, they will kind of expand on like, this is exactly what, like, say, like, I'm looking like at Daisy Jones and the Six, for example. So they have a content warning for drinking, drugs, and smoking. And then somebody here has expanded and saying like they drink a lot of wine, beer, and champagne, hard liquors, consume cigarettes, and pot smoking is visible. Cocaine is also shown being snorted. So then you get like a deeper explanation of what exactly that means. And then the idea is that parents can make more of an educated decision, but it might be helpful for like somebody else that just wants to avoid certain things to poke around on there.
Yeah. To this point about being able to skip over trigger warnings, it could also be nice to just have a broader message before an episode that says this episode might be disturbing for some viewers, and then let people click in to get more details. Give us all the trigger warning, a more vague trigger warning, and then let us click in if we want it. That might be the best solution of all. Just so, or I mean, also, I guess we could also just stop looking at trigger warnings if we don't want to be spoiled and we're willing to take a little risk and we feel like we're not going to be triggered by anything.
I don't personally lean on trigger warnings very much because personally, if I know that I'm not in a good space for a certain type of subject matter, I don't watch that. But I do know that there are plenty of times where you might pick something that you thought was totally safe and surprise, there's something really violent that happens in there that can be triggering. And I understand how that can be really off-putting for people. In general, it's just not something that I personally rely on, but I totally think they should exist for the people who do.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a complicated conversation to have. I know we're not talking about the merits and the pros and cons of trigger warnings on their own. This is a new interpretation of that because I think for years we were so used to hearing about like our trigger warnings, like censoring certain works, or is there an overwhelming pressure to throw a trigger warning on everything? And is that good for people's development necessarily, right? So I like that we're at the point where the conversation is more about how do we make sure, yes, let's have trigger warnings, but like, let's just make sure they don't spoil the fun for everybody.
Yeah. So we asked our listeners too, has a trigger warning ever stopped you from watching something? And there were several comments from people who said trigger warnings had not stopped them, but several people had specific concerns about The Boys. I brought that up earlier. Game of Thrones and Outlander. Those three shows seem to get the most mentions. And our listeners also mentioned pet deaths as a thing they want to avoid and animal harm. Here's some individual feedback, though. Lauren said, recently I had to stop watching Chaos because I could see the animal death coming from a few episodes away. I checked, Does the Dog Die? That's a website. And sure enough, it was going to happen in 4 more episodes. I feel like 95% of the time that an animal is included in a non-romance movie or show, they kill them off for the drama. Also, I switched from Goodreads to Storygraph because Storygraph provides trigger warnings. I read books to escape the real world. I don't need to feel uncomfortable or disgusted in the books that I read. Sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, animal death, and torture are always no-goes for me. If I want to be part of the conversation, I'll have my spouse or a friend tell me about the general story. Those are 2 good recs. Thank you, Lauren. And Pam, aren't you a fan of Storygraph, by the way? Didn't you give that as a rec a while ago?
I love Storygraph. So sometimes like, I think I read a book that, because usually I just look at the tags to see that that's kind of how people will review on Storygraph. So in addition to like giving a star review, you can just, they make it really easy to just click on certain things. So you can like click on whether you thought it was fast paced, medium paced, or slow. And then they ask you to say like if you feel like it was more character focused or like story focused. And anyway, it's really great because even if a book does not specifically state that there's, say, rape, somebody that's reviewed it could have tagged that, and that helps the rest of the community out. So yeah, big fan of Storygraph. Highly recommend. Love all of the features. There's like a paid version, but the free version is fantastic too. So
Allison said, I have decided to not read some books based on the trigger warnings for them. However, lately I've been wishing there wasn't trigger warnings on some books. Sometimes the trigger warnings slightly spoil where the story is headed. Other times I've nearly missed out on an enjoyable book because of trigger warnings for a short scene. Grant said, it's never stopped me, but I do appreciate a warning to get in the right headspace. Autumn said, you all should listen to the search engine episode on trigger warnings. It's super interesting. They find that most people do not avoid content with trigger warnings, and a lot of people actually seek out triggering items. In addition, actual triggers are often the events and environments surrounding the trauma and not the trauma itself. So if you were assaulted in a mall, malls may be triggering, but assault wouldn't be. Therefore, trigger warnings can be kind of useless in a lot of scenarios. I highly recommend the podcast episode, though, to learn more. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, Madeline said, I really appreciate having trigger warnings for self-harm and suicide being portrayed in media so that I know I need to be prepared to skip those scenes. It's not good for my brain to see that. For me, it's not a question of if I can handle it, but if I should have to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will say, I definitely agree, Madeline. There are times when I've seen self-harm reflected in shows and felt a little like queasy and like, did we need to show it like that? Like, it could still be part of the story. I'm not saying remove it from the narrative, but like, I also feel like there's an artful way to shoot some of these more challenging topics that isn't going to make me cover my face with my hands, for example. Because that,
Right.
honestly, I will say, like, self-harm, that is one, if I see that, I definitely am covering my face because I can't stand it. It won't stop me from watching something, but I will definitely avert my eyes while it's happening.
Yeah, I will often just like peek through my eyes and just get ready to fully cover my eyes with my hands if something is going to make me squeamish. But on a related note, also just wanted to mention that Matt Smith, who starred in Doctor Who and a variety of other shows and movies, he recently chimed in on content being watered down in order to not disturb anyone. He said there's been too much policing of stories and being afraid to bring them out because a climate is a certain way, and that's a shame. It's okay to feel uncomfortable or provoked while looking at a painting or watching a play, but I worry everything's being dialed and dumbed down. And he got a little backlash for this, but we also wanted to take this from the trigger warning angle, right, Pam?
Yeah. And, just to comment on that, I can understand why he did, because Matt Smith is currently starring on House of the Dragon. And if anything's going to need trigger warnings, it's anything related to the Game of Thrones universe. So,
Yeah.
I could understand why people were not pleased with hearing this. But specifically with how this relates to trigger warnings, I think the one thing I wanted to talk about is just the fact that I think it's really easy to read a comment like what Matt Smith said, or even to see an article like the one Variety posted and automatically think, well, surely it's the public that has steered us in this direction, which makes sense because we have seen a lot of policing as part of like purity culture happening, especially in fandom spaces over the course of the last, I would say, like 7 to 10 years or so. But the interesting thing about trigger warnings is that it's actually not the public that has popularized this. Apparently, trigger warnings really rose in popularity as a direct result of Netflix's 13 Reasons Why adaptation, super controversial series, and it was slammed by critics for glorifying suicide. They have since taken the suicide scene out, which is that kind of goes to show just how much flack they got for
It was
that
bad.
depiction. It was really bad.
Yeah. They did not need to do that. I am not someone who is easily shocked. So I feel like it means something, that a lot of people who feel that way watch that scene and were like, whoa.
Yeah.
Because
a lot of
I didn't think it was coming. I thought they were going to cut away.
And it was geared towards younger audiences, that show was, right?
Mm-hmm. A lot of the violence was just on that show too, felt unnecessary. Like there's a sodomy scene that also felt like it went too far. And there was a lot that I could not stomach. Also, as somebody that is not easily triggered, and also doesn't have like a particular reason to be triggered specifically by those things. So it's just, I think that's why that, like, this example really resonated with a lot of people. But in addition to all of that, studies also came out with regards to 13 Reasons Why that showed that there was a direct association with a significant increase in monthly suicide rates amongst young people as a direct result of this show. So even though the creators were saying they were hoping that the show would be a deterrent, it actually ended up having the opposite effect. So I think it's interesting to keep this in mind, because what this really means is that streamers and networks are going all in on trigger warnings in an effort to kind of cover their own behinds. This was really bad press for Netflix for a really long time. And I'm sure that other networks and streamers took that into account, and they've been trying to avoid a similar kind of scandal. So then it's still possible to make shows that are edgy, that feature maybe graphic depictions of things like self-harm, without actually having to gain any bad press, because, hey, like, we told you this was coming. You made the decision to keep watching.
Well, and speaking broadly, not about suicide or anything specific, but I think we do need these episodes of television and these stories depicted across media. It's good to feel uncomfortable, and the studios are too afraid to bother anybody. They don't want that negative media coverage. So it's like these studios really just got to buckle down and be like, you know what? We want to tell the story that we believe in, that we think is the right story to tell. Of course, there's going to be lines that shouldn't be crossed, like this 13 Reasons Why example, but we have seen studios resist telling stories because they're afraid of causing the smallest of ripples in the ocean.
Yeah, I agree. This also makes me think of back when critique of trigger warnings was big because of it happening on college campuses, and there being like more of a drive and an insistence.
Yes.
Yeah. And I feel I have really nuanced feelings about trigger warnings, if that's not clear. Like I think they're a really good thing to have. I also don't think that there's something that should just be thrown at everything and used as a reason to avoid challenging topics sometimes. Like, it is good for people, generally speaking, to be able to process discomfort with topics in a safe space, like your college classroom or like your living room if you're watching a TV show, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, that doesn't mean that trigger warnings don't have a place. I think they're just so new that we haven't found out the right way to tailor them so that they're not disruptive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to keep everybody happy.
Yeah. Because you're right. It would be so easy for somebody that just like feels uncomfortable with, say, the subject of slavery to be like, oh, that's my trigger warning. But it's like, sometimes you need to be uncomfortable to learn about something that's really important.
Yeah. And those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Like,
right. Exactly. Yeah. We have to sometimes be a little uncomfortable.
But there are lines. There are absolutely lines. And what makes this all the more complicated is that everyone's line is different. Elizabeth in the Discord has an interesting thought. She says, I would support a way to tie it into the movie and TV ratings we already have in the US based system, which I think is somewhat consumer driven. So yeah, like the MPAA ratings, like if there were a way to leverage that to be a little more specific. Although I guess at the same time, if a movie's rated R and because they usually give a reason for a rating.
They do.
Right.
And that is the issue with that too, is that they're constantly changing. We were just talking about this on What the Hype. So like we did a Beetlejuice episode that Laura led, and we were all reminiscing on the original Beetlejuice movie from the 80s, which like features like an F-bomb. There's like a lot of suggestive comedy. There's like crude and like vulgar, stuff in there. And that movie's rated PG-13 because the MPAA rating, or it's rated PG because the MPAA rating in the 80s was not what it is today. Another good example is 16 Candles is also rated PG-13, but they show a fully naked high school student. Well, it's probably like an adult, but an adult that plays a high school student in the gym showers. So stuff like that now would automatically be rated R because you saw a woman fully nude.
Right. Because we're prudes now.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky either way. But yes, like all of it needs to be revamped, which I think is what we've boiled it down to.
All right. Well, it's an interesting discussion, and we'll leave it there for now. After the break, we are going to talk about Sean Diddy Combs. We will be right back.
In light of the discussion we've just had, I think it's appropriate to give a soft trigger warning here for this discussion, because if you've been keeping up with what's going on with Diddy, aka Sean Combs, you'll know that he was arrested last Monday after a Manhattan grand jury indicted him on charges of racketeering and sex trafficking. The music mogul has been under mounting scrutiny since a 2023 lawsuit by his former girlfriend, Cassie, who is also a singer and model. She accused him of sex trafficking along with years of abuse. And we wanted to talk about this and kind of pair it with the overall discussion about trigger warnings, because it is so pop culture centric, and we've seen so much movement in Hollywood, in the pop culture space around conversations of like what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what are the things that people have been able to get away with in terms of abuses of power. So this conversation really felt like it fit here, but also wanted to talk about it because this is the first major sexual misconduct case in the music world since R. Kelly, who was sentenced to more than 30 years in prison for child sex crimes, sex trafficking, and racketeering as well. I also just want to give some props to Pam, who checked me on all of my notes here, because she is definitely a lot more knowledgeable about the music world and the background relating to these artists and what made them who they are today. So like I texted Pam on Sunday and I was like, hey, my notes are in. Can you check and make sure it's right?
You didn't need any help. You actually did a fantastic job. So,
but I say that because I know you have a lot of knowledge and insight, and I know that you're going to be able to add a lot to the discussion. And I think just the fact that all three of us grew up in the 90s when Diddy was really coming to fame, I think that there's going to be something we can all add to this. But I wanted to kind of talk about how we got here and how Diddy really shaped the world of rap and hip hop as we knew it. Because for me, when I think about the rap world, like pre 1990s, it's very different than what we saw. I feel like it was a lot more prevalent to see a sort of opulence, really favored, like lots of imagery of wealth, as well as prominent rappers having their hands in multiple pies, not just being rappers. Like, for example, Diddy started his own record label. He started Bad Boy Records in 1993. He started Sean John, which is his high-end fashion label. He, over the years, has been a promoter for various vodka and tequila brands. And in a lot of ways, he's the one who kind of started that, right, Pam? Because rap was different
It was
before
when you're
this
looking.
phase.
Yeah. And obviously rap has gone through a number of changes when you look at like the history of hip hop and rap and where it all started and stuff like that, because it really all started with like, it kind of has its roots in like funk and jazz as well. When you look at like the artists that were coming up in the 80s and the early years of rap music, a lot of it was like more melodic. And it kind of centered around sampling. So if you think of like Run DMC, which has like more melodic undertones, and they were really big in the 80s. It's a huge difference between what we saw in the early 90s, which we were probably too young to remember, but that's when you kind of started to see the rise of gangster rap. So if you think about like NWA, East Coast versus West Coast, a lot of it was way more autobiographical, though some of it was still maybe exaggerating. But the idea really that you should keep in mind is that a lot of it was about life, like real life growing up, a lot of times in underfunded communities or in the projects. So you had these artists like Tupac and Biggie that were not sugarcoating the experiences that they had growing up in poor neighborhoods and also growing up as young Black men. And I'm really glad that you mentioned Bad Boy Records, because a big reason why Diddy really was able to rise to fame is because he signed Biggie to his label. And he was kind of like the butt of the joke, not Biggie, but Diddy. Especially when you look at like the East Coast, West Coast rap rivalry that was happening around this time. And one of the big digs that they would always kind of throw in the face of Biggie, who was one of the bigger rappers at the time when all of this was happening, is like, who in their right mind lets their manager come on and like walk all over their tracks and feature, which was not something that was happening. So even in the early days, like he was kind of getting his ass handed to him because he was kind of like almost like inserting himself forcefully into the limelight as a result of just managing one of the biggest rappers of the time.
In prepping for this, I definitely learned that, I learned a lot about the beef that 50 Cent has with Diddy. And one of the allegations, there's several of them, is that Diddy, just because, I guess, does Bad Boy Records own all of Biggie's masters? Because I guess there's been a lot of controversy about Diddy using those and really leaning on them very heavily.
Mm-hmm. He has leaned a lot on Biggie's legacy. If you look at like probably his biggest crossover hit, his first biggest crossover hit, it was I'll Be Missing You, which sampled I'll Be Watching You. And he was only able to write that because Biggie died. He was shot. If you hear, some people think that Diddy was actually behind that and also Tupac's shooting. That's yet to be determined. But the reason why they think that maybe there was some bad blood in the end there between Biggie and Diddy is because Biggie also had dreams of wanting to be a rap mogul before he was slain. And he was actually wanting to leave Bad Boy Records to start his own record company right around the time that he was shot. So after that happens, Diddy obviously, he goes solo and he really ushers in this new wave of rap where, like Laura was saying, the vibe is way more opulent and you start seeing a lot of like money being flashed around more. This is when you get to like the big yacht parties and these lavish music videos with like the designer clothing and lots of bling and lots of scantily clad women. And that is probably like the rap that we remember growing up with in the early 2000s, right? Because a lot of it was about like flashing money, even if you didn't have it. So all of a sudden, rap in terms of content switches from this is what life is like on the streets to like, I've made it out of the streets. Look at how successful I am, even if you're not quite there yet.
Funnily enough, over the course of all this time, when Diddy's been so prominent. Um, he's had bad behavior come up repeatedly over the years. But it was really, the case that his former girlfriend, Cassie, brought with her lawsuit that really brought about more scrutiny of some of the other allegations that have been made against Diddy. Um, so a real breaking point in the case with Cassie was Diddy's team had initially responded to Cassie's lawsuit, flat out denying her allegations. And this was just fucking awful. After that happened, CNN came into possession of a violent surveillance video of Diddy abusing her, to which he responded by posting a rambling 9-minute long apology video to Instagram. After that, his homes in Los Angeles and Miami were actually raided by the feds in connection with an ongoing investigation into the other allegations that had been levied against him. So long before he was arrested last Monday, the wheels were already in motion and he was already being investigated at a federal level because the amount of allegations and the credibility behind them really reached a fever pitch where it finally did happen. So I think we can all agree that that's a good thing, but I wanted to ask what's maybe a hard question. Do we have faith in justice ultimately being served here? And I say that because I'm remembering the most recent developments in the Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby cases, where initially we thought justice was being served. Things later got overturned.
Well, I mean, the evidence that we've seen so far, including that video that you mentioned from CNN, seems pretty damning. But I think it is impossible to say because of rulings getting overturned. Didn't something was it the Harvey case that it got overturned over a stupid technicality? Am I thinking of the
Yeah.
right case? Yeah. So
Right.
you just never know how this stuff is going to go. But there is hope that this case with Diddy will mark the start of the Me Too movement in the music industry. Because when it did start with Harvey and Bill Cosby, it didn't really touch the music industry back then. And it's partly because the music industry, just like Hollywood, is run by a lot of men who have a lot of money, who can pay people off. There's a lot of partying. It's like this crazy world that is very abusive towards women. There is a study that showed well over 60%, I want to say 67% of women in the music industry say they have been victims of some form of abuse in the workplace there. So it's just a really messy environment. And hopefully this is the beginning of something changing in the music industry.
And women that are silenced in different ways. Like I think about JoJo. I don't know if you all remember JoJo, like
do.
Get Out JoJo. The reason she disappeared is a direct result of being silenced by her record label. And, we've also seen that happen with Kesha as well. She was kind of like one of the first to bring forth a sexual assault case. And Dr. Luke just produced Katy Perry's new stuff.
And Katy Perry stands by him and made up some BS excuse about that.
Yeah. Not very girl power of you, Katy Perry.
Yeah. And that album, I haven't even touched it because the reviews are terrible, so I'm not even going to bother. But all that to work with Dr. Luke, who just gave her a shitty album. Like, was it worth it, Katie? I don't think so. So, but to your point, Pam, like, this is active BS currently happening in the music industry. We can't even fully move on from Dr. Luke.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Men get such a big pass in the industry, and it's crazy to see how untouchable it almost is. It almost does, to Laura's point, like make you lose faith a little bit, even in the justice system. I will probably gain a smidge more faith if they do stand their grounds and not allow him to post bail. That's been a big part of this that's been developing. And the last I read, he's been like offering up everything at his disposal under the sun to just allow, like, to just to see if they'll allow him to post bail. Like, he's offering to give up his house, his mother's house, his jet. He said he'll wear a GPS. Like,
what a sweetheart.
Yeah, I know.
Like,
but
I'll give up
don't
my
worry,
mom's
Laura.
house.
His mom's house is only worth $2 million. So it's
but I'm presuming he bought it for her.
No,
like,
of course, yeah. It's crazy, but yeah. So I think that, like, if they don't let him post bail, if they stick to their guns on that, then I'll probably have a little bit more faith in a trial that's fair. Because you're right, a lot. I mean, even looking, this is such small potatoes in comparison. But if you look at, like, the Justin Timberlake trial, like, he got off with basically a slap on the wrist for his DUI, and it's a result of having enough money to hire the right lawyers.
Yep,
which is so often the case in Hollywood.
Yeah, and in this country in general, to be honest, like, you can buy your way out of almost anything when it comes to, it's gross. Yeah, it's interesting because Katie is calling something out in the Discord that I tend to agree with. She says, I could absolutely see him actually getting convicted for the financial crimes and less so for the sexual crimes. I think we see this a lot. I think it might be easier to get him on the racketeering charges than the other, just because we've seen that. I think, like, as a country, like, our legal system hasn't yet figured out how to, like, try cases of sexual assault consistently.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, I would say that maybe the like the R. Kelly trial, which happened not long ago, we covered that on this show as well. I guess the hope is that would set a good precedent, right? Because it's similar. But you're right, in terms of sexual assault. Unfortunately, in terms of sexual assault trials, especially when women are involved, it's very rare that ruling comes down fairly on the side of the victims. So it's hard to say, but I'm sure that they'll be referencing that case, or they'll be thinking about that case when it comes time to, deliver a verdict or to make a decision one way or the other. I think, like, the only other thing too is, like, there's so much evidence, and I don't know how you spin evidence that's, like, literally so black and white that it's like, here's video footage here,
right?
Like the like, all, like, did you guys read about, like, the baby oil and lube that they confiscated? It's like, why do you need that much?
I saw someone on TikTok holding up a bottle of baby oil, and it was like a miniature bottle, and she was like, I have a baby, like, I've had this for 4 months, and that's how much I've used. Like, you don't need that much.
1,000 bottles of baby oil.
It's insane.
The sex sessions have been described as freak-offs. Like, there's a lot of stuff that's coming out that doesn't look good for him. Not to say there's anything wrong with the sex party, but what he did, we're finding out.
It's not consensual.
When you're coercing people to do it so that you can watch and videotape it.
And not a good look for a lot of these famous celebrities that were there, right, Laura?
Yeah. So actually, I wanted to take us to maybe what is a lighter part of this discussion. I don't know if there's
Gossip
if there's a graceful way to bridge into that. But Pam, you had mentioned when we were planning for this that this might be like the Harvey Weinstein moment for the music world, because there are a lot of prominent names that we may see getting subpoenaed, like Jennifer Lopez, who dated Diddy in the late 90s, when he, like, that absolutely lines up with the timeline of when he was doing some of this shit. He's been friends with Jay-Z for a very, very long time. And I will say that 50 Cent has been very vocal about this issue. Of course, he and Diddy, like I said at the top, have a feud that goes back a really, really long time. But he's producing a documentary into the allegations against Diddy. And he has been calling out Jay-Z for his silence on Instagram. He put up like a picture of like a cardboard milk carton that had a missing photo of Jay-Z on it. And it was just like, why aren't you saying anything about this? Like, I think he said we can't unsee what we saw.
Mm-hmm. It's not funny, but it is, because it's like 50 Cent has been petty. He has taken every opportunity to take a shot at Diddy over the years that one can. When they raided his house, he was like live tweeting basically on his Instagram.
He's so petty.
It was like Christmas came early for that man, because he's been talking about how much of a shithead Diddy is for decades, literal decades. So yeah, when he says he's going to produce this documentary and he's going to hold all these people accountable, I kind of believe him. So
yeah, I just, it's one of these things too, where it's like, there's a huge potential for bias here that I think is really important to know about when he, like, obviously, I think we're on the same page about what Diddy did. I think we all know what he did, but like, when it comes to things like he's responsible for the deaths of Tupac and Biggie, I'm like, okay, I don't think there's anything to really substantiate that apart from hearsay.
Mm-hmm. If that comes out, that would be just the bombshell on top of a number of bombshells.
That would be fucking wild.
But that's been a rumor for like since they got shot, basically. Mm-hmm. Well, since Tupac got shot anyway.
Yeah. So. Usher, also longtime friend, who kind of he's towards the top of the list of like most likely to get
and he
called
just
to
cleared
testify.
his Twitter.
Which is not. I'm glad you mentioned that.
It's not a good look.
No, it's not. It's not. Something else that like this one makes me squirm. Justin Bieber has really been in Diddy's orbit for a long time, including when he was a very, very young child just getting started in the music world. And I don't know if y'all have seen any of the footage of them together. But it makes me uneasy knowing what we know that Diddy did, that he had so much time around this young child.
And also over the last week, there have been some disturbing clips of older artists interacting with Bieber back in the day. So people are wondering if a lot more is going to be coming out about how Bieber was treated back then.
Yeah. Yeah. And people are hard on him because he's not always had the best behavior, but it's like sometimes you should wait and see before you start passing judgment on people, because if he even had to experience just like being exposed to things that a child shouldn't have been exposed to, that it paints everything in a completely different light.
He was also a very young child, just to reiterate that. I mean, he's currently 30. So, I mean, when he blew up, he was what, 14, 15 years old?
Yeah.
No kid would be ready for the spotlight on the level that he was with songs like Baby.
Oh gosh, I remember the year of that song. I was teaching at the time, and I was teaching like sixth grade during the summer months in Costa Rica because they have school year round. And it was all they sang. It was all they fucking sang.
Yeah.
It drove me nuts.
And listening to that song now, I feel like a creep listening to it because he sounds so young. He's like, baby, baby, baby. And it's just like his prepubescent voice. It's not like, oh, they auto-tuned it to make him sound younger or something. No, he sounds like a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth's bringing up a good point too. So Usher talked about what he was exposed to living with Diddy at 13, but has backtracked his statement. So the fact that like Usher was also managing Justin and didn't think that it was not okay to bring him around, that also not a good look.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks for sharing all that, you two. It sounds like this story is just beginning and there might be some hard new information unearthed in the coming months and years, maybe. But again, maybe this is the music industry's reckoning. So at least there's that.
Would be a big one. Would be a good start.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, coming up in After Dark today, we just us are going to be having some fun by making our listeners uncomfortable, because we're going to be calling some of our patrons tonight. This is a series that we kicked off a few months ago, and we'll be continuing it today. So that will be available at patreon.com/millennial.
After Dark is part of Mega Millennial, which you get every week when you're a patron or Apple Podcast subscriber. It's also ad-free because we prefer your support over working with advertisers. Visit patreon.com/millennial to pledge today, or Apple Podcast users can tap into the show and subscribe to the Mega Millennial feed.
And we have many other Patreon benefits, including recording studio access, our monthly variety shows, access to our planning meetings, and in October, we're launching a brand new benefit. It's called From the Vaults, Smart Mouths. And 2 episodes of Smart Mouths will be released every month on Patreon. Plus, we will be publishing each episode's original show plans for the first time ever. Those are going to be getting released to the public, well, our patrons anyway. So we're very excited about this benefit. It's easy to get started through our membership platforms. Apple Podcasts and Patreon offer 7-day free trials and annual subscription discounts. Time for recommendations. What do you got for us, Laura?
I want to recommend Arcane on Netflix. So this is, it's an animated series. It is based on the League of Legends game. It is so good. I don't play League. And all I know about League is what I know from Mark because he plays it. But we sat down to watch the show because my dad's really into it and season 2 is coming out. So we were like, okay, we got to check it out. We sat down the other night and blew through like 6 episodes in one sitting. It is so good. So definitely check that out. Season 2 is right around the corner.
I really love that show too. I had no idea it was League of Legends until like embarrassingly long after I had binged it the first season.
The great thing is you don't have to know anything about League to enjoy the show, which is great.
It's great. Yeah. And I love the animation style too. It's really,
it's beautiful.
It's really cool. Yeah. We were talking a little bit about Converse at the top of the show, and I noticed some people talking about insoles for Converse in the Discord. So with that in mind, I wanted to recommend foot soles. These are insoles that have been specifically made with Converse in mind. And it was just like made by somebody that is a lover of Converse and always wears them. And I mean, I've worn Converse for years. That's like one of the maybe 3 shoe brands that I will like never give up having in my closet. And these insoles are a game changer. I don't find Converse to be particularly uncomfortable personally, but if you're looking for a little bit more comfort, and you're trying to wear these, all day, every day, then I would highly recommend getting some foot soles because they're really great.
I'll pass those to my mom as well.
Yeah.
Laura, since you recommended a TV show, I've decided I'm going to recommend something I binged over the weekend. Chimp Crazy. Have you 2 heard about this? It's very popular on Max right now.
What is it?
I haven't heard of it.
4-episode docuseries. I'll just tell you this. It's by the team who created Tiger King.
Oh, God.
Same types of characters, but they love chimpanzees, okay? I don't need to say any more. Please go and watch this. It's a fun watch and disturbing, but mostly fun.
Is there a Joe Exotic of the chimp world?
Yeah. Her name is Tanya. She's the Dolly Parton of chimpanzees. I think she
was going to say, is
herself.
Tanya also trying to make it as a singer? So you said Dolly Parton, and you told me everything I need to know.
And she's very serious about her lip fillers too. So
oh, wow.
You can imagine the type of character she is. She prioritizes that over many things, as you see in this docuseries.
Well, honestly, I have a little bit of time coming up that I'm going to need to fill with some light watching. So
you'll get more than one laugh out of it. Please watch Chimp Crazy.
All right, pals, listen up. It's time for us to give you a few reminders. Please make sure you're following the show in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode, and leave us a review in Apple Podcasts and or Spotify. 5 stars, please. And don't forget, we're now releasing video episodes on YouTube.
To stay in touch with us, email millennialshow@gmail.com or visit millennialshow.com. While you're there, you'll also find all the links to our various social media channels. So please be sure to give us a follow on those. Spotify users can also leave feedback directly within an episode.
After Dark starts in a moment for patrons and Apple Podcast subscribers. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I'm Andrew.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Pamela.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.